In the quiet corners of history, there are stories not often told, stories shaped by human strength and human failure. This is one of those stories. The accounts we share now reach back through time to reveal moments that changed the world. Let us begin by travelling into a past long forgotten yet still echoing into our present. What occurs when you reunite people separated by language, culture and faith? Under a single banner, Yugoslavia appeared to have the solution until it shattered in a wave of brutality that stunned everyone. Yet its tale does not start with the wars of the 1990s. To grasp how a nation once viewed as a model of togetherness came undone, we must look back ages, from South Slavs under Ottoman and Habsburg control, through Balkan conflicts, 2 world wars, royal rule communist uprising and Cold War neutrality. Yugoslavia was always more delicate than it looked. This is how a vision of togetherness turned into a fight to survive, and a warning of what happens when identity, power and history meet the South. Slavs arrived in the Balkans during the great migrations of the 6th and 7th centuries. The region was already a meeting point of cultures influenced by Greek, Roman and Byzantine traditions. These new Slavic groups spread over mountains and valleys, forming communities from the Alps to the Adriatic and deep into the Balkans. Today, their descendants live in Slovenia, Croatia, Bosnia, and Herzegovina, Serbia, Montenegro, North Macedonia, and Bulgaria. But in those early days, their political life was not centralized. Villages, tribes, and loose principalities defined their world, and local chiefs often held more sway than any far-off king or emperor. By the medieval period, these societies started forming known kingdoms, though their fortunes rose and fell within Europe's larger power games. For example, Croats and Slovens fell under Hungarian and later Habsburg influence. Meanwhile, Serbs built their own medieval states, facing pressure from Byzantium in the east. Bosnia stood apart with its unique church and periods of self-rule before neighbours pressed in. Rather than one large entity, the South Slavic lands were a quilt of territories that changed hands with the tides of military and political advantage. This fragile patchwork was exposed when great empires pushed into the area. The Ottoman Empire advanced into the Balkans in the late Middle Ages. Their win at Kosovo in 1389 began centuries of Ottoman rule in Serbia, Bosnia, Macedonia, and much of Montenegro. Meanwhile, the Habsburg dynasty extended its reach over northern and western lands, including modern Slovenia and parts of Croatia. Living for centuries under rival empires, the South Slavs came to embody 2 different worlds, split sharply by religion and governance. Faith played a central role in shaping identities under the Catholic Habsburgs. Croats and Slovenes aligned with Latin Christianity and the Pope. Under the Orthodox traditions of the Serbian Church, Serbs grew within Eastern Christianity under Ottoman rule. Many Bosnians converted to Islam, sometimes for social and legal benefits. Shared Slavic linguistic roots were increasingly overshadowed by distinct religious traditions that moulded politics, culture and loyalties for centuries. These divisions would shape life for generations and fuel rivalries long into the modern age. Despite this, a shared South Slavic identity did not exist for most of this time. People called themselves Croat, Serb, Slovene or Bosnian, but no one said they were Yugoslav loyalty tied to church dynasty or empire, not to ethnic unity. Only with the intellectual shifts of the 19th century did thinkers begin to imagine a political future where all South Slavs stood together in one state, the very word Yugoslavia simply meaning land of the South. Slavs was not a ruling power's plan, but an idea first drafted by intellectuals and revolutionaries dreaming of a different future. One cultural detail shows how deeply the past lived on. In parts of Croatia, priests wrote in Glagolitic, one of the oldest Slavic alphabets, until the 1800s. Long after Europe moved to standard print, this ancient script tied communities to old worship and literacy. It showed how uneven, layered and historically complex South Slavic cultural identity remained. They lived side by side, sharing language and heritage. Yet daily life was divided by empires, doctrines, and traditions, making unity nearly impossible in this long pre-Yugoslav era. During the 19th century, a wave of romantic nationalism swept Europe, changing how groups saw themselves and their history for the divided South. Slavs, this mood led intellectuals to look inward for what bound their people together. They uncovered folk songs, stories, and linguistic links as proof of a shared past. These rediscoveries were not just academic, they carried a political message, suggesting that Slavic groups across the Balkans and Central Europe could be more than subjects of Austria-Hungary or the Ottoman Sultan in Croatia. This idea grew through the Illyrian movement. Leaders used the ancient name Illyrian not for historical precision, but as a unifying label beyond local or tribal identities. Writers, scholars, and reformers embraced this concept, working toward a vision of South Slavs linked by culture and language. Their poetry, songs, and journalism framed unity as possible and necessary, even if political conditions made it seem out of reach. What began as cultural revival planted seeds of political ambition, and Vienna and Budapest quickly noticed where it was headed. Meanwhile, in Serbia, a different national consciousness was forming. Having won independence from the Ottomans in the early 19th century, Serbia stood as a sovereign South Slavic state. Intellectuals used this freedom to revive medieval Serbian traditions, celebrate Orthodox heritage, and emphasize continuity from old Serbian kingdoms. The result was a Pan-Slavism that saw Serbia as a natural leader of any future South Slavic state. For Serbs, the path seemed clearer than for Croats or Slovenes, who lived under Habsburg rule and balanced rising nationalism with loyalty to a powerful empire. Here, nationalism became a double-edged sword. On one hand, it offered hope of uniting long-fragmented Slavs. On the other, it sharpened divisions: Catholic Croats, Orthodox Serbs, Muslim Bosniaks, and Slovenes under Austrian influence often expressed national pride in ways that clashed rather than converged. Unity under a shared Slavic identity might inspire students, poets, and activists, but it alarmed ruling powers and divided communities along both new and old lines. Nationalism promised freedom from empires, but it also highlighted how differently empires had shaped each population over centuries. Authorities in Vienna and Budapest viewed these movements with suspicion. The Austro-Hungarian Empire contained many languages, religions, and national groups. Any talk of Slavic unity looked like a threat to imperial stability. Censorship, political repression, and attempts to undermine nationalist groups were common responses. Yet such resistance sometimes gave the movements more energy, as activists could portray their struggle as proof. Their cultural survival was at risk. Suppressing nationalist movements often turned them into rallying cries that were hard to silence. During this time, reformers like the Croatian poet Ljudevit Gaj promoted a shared literary standard, believing common written language could bridge fragmented dialects. He even created a new alphabet for this vision. While not fully adopted by all South Slavs, it laid groundwork for what later became Serbo-Croatian. This effort shows how deeply nationalism intertwined with cultural projects, as if literature and language themselves were tools of political destiny. By the early 20th century, nationalism had a sharper edge. Groups like Narodna Odbrana, which began focusing on defence and promotion of Serbian causes, expanded into secret efforts to shape political outcomes across the Balkans. Such groups were influential enough that their ideas linked to high-profile violence. One ideological branch helped inspire the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in 1914, an act that would ignite the First World War. What started in the 19th century as songs, poems, and cultural festivals had within generations transformed into conspiracies and armed struggle. At the start of the 20th century, the Ottoman Empire still controlled vast Balkan lands, but its power was fading for South Slavs under or near Ottoman rule. This weakness created an opportunity. By 1912, a coalition of Balkan states, Serbia, Montenegro, Greece and Bulgaria, formed the Balkan League. Their goal was simple and ambitious: drive the Ottomans out of Europe for good and divide the lands held by Ottomans for centuries. This alliance brought together states with overlapping ambitions. Though unity was fragile, it was strong enough to start the First Balkan War. The war began in October 1912, and within weeks Ottoman armies struggled on many fronts. Montenegro made early advances. Serbian forces moved deep into Kosovo and northern Macedonia. Greek victories on the southern front broke Ottoman control along the coast, while Bulgarians pushed east toward Thrace, aiming for routes to Constantinople. The rapid Ottoman collapse was striking, given their centuries of firm control in southeastern Europe. For Serbia, the gains were dramatic. Its territory almost doubled, expanding into Kosovo and much of Macedonia lands with both symbolic value and practical advantage. Serbia's expansion built confidence among its leaders. Many saw their victories as proof Serbia could lead South Slavic unification. A larger territory and greater prestige positioned Serbia strongly in any future movement to unite the region's fragmented Slavic populations. But new problems came with these gains. Macedonia, for example, was claimed by multiple sides. Bulgarians pointed to cultural and church ties, while Greeks, Serbs, and local groups had their own arguments. Instead of resolving rivalries, divisions grew sharper once liberation from Ottoman rule became real. Peace did not last. By summer 1913, tensions in the victorious coalition erupted into the Second Balkan War. Bulgaria, unhappy with its share of land from the First War, turned on its former allies. Bulgarian forces attacked Serbia and Greece, hoping to secure more of Macedonia. The move backfired. The combined opposition of Serbia, Greece, Montenegro and later Romania overwhelmed Bulgaria's armies, forcing retreat. The Treaty of Bucharest that ended the fighting left. Bulgaria weakened while Serbia gained even more territory for the south. Slavs, these wars intensified nationalist rivalries. Macedonia remained a focal point, each nation insisting on historical linguistic claims with no easy solution. The victories made Serbia stronger. Yet they also made Austria-Hungary nervous. Vienna saw a rising Serbia as a regional threat and an influence that could stir its own Slavic population within the multi-ethnic empire. That fear would later shape every decision Austria made when tensions rose in summer 1914. One notable aspect is how the world saw these wars. The Balkan Wars were the first widely captured on film and photography, giving international audiences images of trench warfare, destroyed towns, and mass mobilization before the First World War. And despite Bulgaria's clashes with Serbia in 1913, just years earlier, the two had secretly agreed to divide Ottoman lands between them. Such shifting alliances highlight the volatility of Balkan politics, a volatility that would echo in conflicts to come. On June 28, 1914, Archduke Franz Ferdinand travelled to Sarajevo, the capital of Bosnia, then under Austro-Hungarian rule. A planned symbolic visit quickly turned historic. A group of young Bosnian Serb nationalists plotted an attack. Among them was a 19-year-old student named Gavrilo Princip. When the Archduke's motorcade passed near the Latin Bridge, Princip fired shots, killing both Franz Ferdinand and his wife Sophie. The attack was not just a local event. It tapped directly into tensions between Serb nationalists seeking liberation from the empire and Vienna's leadership fearing Serbia's growing strength. Austria-Hungary responded within weeks. Seeing the assassination as evidence of Serbian aggression, not just one individual's act, the empire issued an ultimatum to Serbia with German backing. When Serbia's reply failed to satisfy, Vienna War was declared. Because of Europe's interwoven alliance system, this conflict quickly spiraled into something much larger. Russia mobilized to defend Serbia. Germany stood with Austria-Hungary, and France and Britain joined in. What began in Sarajevo became the opening chapter of the First World War. For the South Slavs, the war immediately revealed a painful split. Serbs in the Kingdom of Serbia fought with the Allies, while Croats, Slovenes and Bosniaks, conscripted into the Austro-Hungarian army, fought for the Central Powers. Families and neighbours sharing a language might wear different uniforms on opposite sides of the same battlefield. The war tore communities apart, showing how divided the South Slavic world remained even as nationalist voices called for unity. The consequences were catastrophic, especially for Serbia. Between invasions, hunger disease and major battles, the country suffered one of the worst casualty rates in modern history. Over a quarter of its entire population died, including a large part of its fighting-age men. For Serbia, this devastation also became a powerful symbol internationally. The country's survival and sacrifice won sympathy abroad and gave it leverage when reshaping the region after the war. While soldiers fought on the front, politicians and intellectuals worked behind the scenes. In exile, South Slavic emigrants formed the Yugoslav Committee. Its members, mainly Croats, Slovenes and Serbs living abroad, believed the war created a chance to achieve the dream of South Slavic unity. They made their case in London, Paris and Washington, lobbying Allied powers to support a union once the Central Powers were defeated. Their vision often clashed with more cautious leaders at home worried about losing local autonomy. But the idea gained strength as the war dragged on. By 1917, a key step came with the Corfu Declaration. Leaders from Serbia and the Yugoslav Committee met on the Greek island of Corfu, formally agreeing to work toward a single South Slavic state. Though vague on governance details, it was a public promise that Serbs, Croats and Slovenes would join in one kingdom. After peace returned, Gavrilo Princip himself, too young for execution under Austro-Hungarian law, spent the war imprisoned. He died of tuberculosis 4 years later, never seeing the state he believed his actions might help inspire. Yet by his death in 1918, the war's outcome was shifting fast. The Austro-Hungarian Empire was collapsing, and the question of unification was no longer theoretical, it was imminent. As World War I ended in late 1918, the massive Austro-Hungarian Empire fell apart almost overnight. Once a dominant European power, it lost control of its territories, leaving uncertainty across Central and Southeastern Europe. For the South Slavs, this collapse opened the door to an idea discussed for decades, combining their fragmented lands into one political unit. The power vacuum created a rare opportunity, and local leaders moved quickly to secure it before larger neighbours imposed their own post-war visions. On December 1st, 1918 in Belgrade, the Kingdom of Serbs, Croats and Slovenes was officially proclaimed King Peter I of Serbia, who led his country through the war, became monarch of the new state. This kingdom included Serbia itself, Montenegro already annexed during the war, and South Slavic territories from the dissolved Austro-Hungarian Empire. Slovenia, Croatia, Dalmatia, and Bosnia and Herzegovina. Bringing so many regions into one monarchy seemed to fulfill the long-standing nationalist dream of a South Slavic homeland. But building a unified country proved much harder. Although intellectuals and activists celebrated unity, the new state joined deeply different traditions. Some leaders imagined a centralized country ruled from Belgrade where all citizens were one Yugoslav people. Others, especially Croats and Slovenes, wanted a looser federation with stronger autonomy for each group. Questions of balancing central authority with regional independence caused immediate friction in the first governments. Language and administration brought more challenges. Different regions had centuries of distinct practices under Habsburg or Ottoman rule. These legacies shaped law education and civil administration. Standardizing legal systems was especially difficult because territories like Dalmatia joined before governance arrangements were properly organized. In some areas, overlapping institutions operated at the same time, creating chaos for ordinary people dealing with courts, taxes, or official paperwork. This legal patchwork showed how quickly unification had rushed forward without solving practical problems. The Serbian monarchy and military played a dominant role in the state structure. Serbia's wartime sacrifice had been immense, and its leaders saw this as justification for their leading position. King Peter's royal house, already established and internationally recognised, became the natural foundation for authority. However, this dominance caused significant resentment among Croat Slovenes and others, who felt they had traded Vienna for Belgrade without achieving real equality. Political claims of unity often masked tensions running far deeper than surface appearances. The religious and ethnic divides of earlier centuries did not vanish with the new kingdom. Catholic Croats, Orthodox Serbs, Muslim Bosniaks and others all brought their own traditions and political expectations into this experiment. That these divisions were barely addressed in the rush to create the state meant fault lines remained underneath. While the name on paper suggested unity, the daily experience of many groups felt more like competition for influence. The official title, Kingdom of Serbs, Croats and Slovenes, was cumbersome, reflecting the attempt to acknowledge multiple groups in its wording. Yet most people casually called the state Yugoslavia, a name easier to use and familiar from earlier nationalist talk. This informal use outpaced the official change, which did not come until 1929, when the kingdom officially adopted the name Yugoslavia. The 1918 unification seemed a political triumph, but because it ignored long-standing disputes and differences, the experiment started on fragile ground. The enthusiasm of that December soon gave way to rivalries over power culture and governance. Those unresolved issues would define the new state's political battles. By the late 1920s, the optimism greeting unification had faded into constant deadlock. Parliamentary politics in the Kingdom of Serbs, Croats and Slovenes stalled as parties representing different national groups refused to compromise. Croat representatives demanded more autonomy, Slovenes pushed for federal reforms, and Serb politicians insisted on keeping central authority in Belgrade. The situation grew so tense that in June 1928 a violent incident broke out in the National Assembly when a Montenegrin Serb deputy pulled a gun, shooting several Croat representatives and killing 2. This shocking attack deepened mistrust and made the parliamentary system seem incapable of holding the kingdom together. Against this backdrop, King Alexander I decided to intervene directly, reshaping the political order from above. On January 6, 1929, Alexander suspended the constitution, dissolved the National Assembly, and announced he would rule under a royal dictatorship. His aim was to bypass fractured politics and restore authority by ending disputes over power sharing. He also declared a major symbolic change, renaming the country the Kingdom of Yugoslavia. The new title dropped specific references to Serbs, Croats and Slovenes, using a single label suggesting unity under one people. Alexander hoped to suppress ethnic identities that had dominated political life and strengthen the idea of a collective Yugoslav identity. To further dilute regional loyalties, Alexander reorganized the map. He introduced administrative regions called Banovinas, deliberately cutting across traditional ethnic and historic boundaries. The goal was to weaken nationalist strongholds and tie citizens to the monarchy rather than their ethnic community. For example, Dalmatian Croats found themselves grouped with parts of Bosnia, while Serbs were scattered across different units, not concentrated under one administration. It was a bold attempt to redraw the state's political geography in favour of a new imposed identity. But the cost came quickly. Political parties were banned outright. Newspapers faced censorship and police surveillance expanded. Secret police targeted Croat separatist groups, especially the Ustas movement operating underground and abroad, as well as communist activists in industrial centres and among students. The regime justified these measures as necessary for stability, but opponents saw them as an attack on basic freedoms. Suppressing political voices only pushed resistance movements toward more radical methods. Instead of erasing ethnic divides, authoritarian measures hardened them. In Croatia, frustration with Belgrade deepened and calls for autonomy grew louder. Even in exile communities, many Croat nationalists fled to Hungary or Italy, finding sympathetic governments supporting them against Yugoslavia. Other minorities, including Macedonians and Bosniaks, also felt increasingly alienated. Alexander's vision of unity looked less like integration and more like domination, especially to groups sidelined by Serb dominance in the army and administration. The king's dictatorship lasted only a few years. On October 9, 1934, while travelling to Marseille in France, Alexander was assassinated during a state visit. The killing was organised jointly by the Ustase and the Internal Macedonian Revolutionary Organisation, both long-time opponents of Yugoslav centralism. The assassin, Vlado Chernozemski, fired at close range, killing Alexander and the French foreign minister beside him. The attack was captured on film the first time a head of state's death was recorded by news cameras. It stunned the world and confirmed how unstable Yugoslavia remained beneath the surface. Chernozemski had no escape plan and carried out the attack with precision. Reports later revealed the plot was carefully prepared with backup shooters and accomplices disguised as journalists. Alexander's death left a power vacuum since his son Peter II was still a boy. A regency council stepped in to rule, but without the king's personal control, the authoritarian framework he created quickly unravelled, leaving the country drifting back into instability. When King Alexander was assassinated in Marseilles in 1930 for the succession could not be resolved directly. His son Peter I was still a minor, so the country entered a regency. The person dominating this arrangement was Prince Paul Kara, or Ivic Alexander's cousin. For much of the following decade, Paul shaped Yugoslavia's internal and foreign policies. Even though Peter's name provided the monarch's legitimacy, governing through compromise became Paul's main challenge. But no compromise ever seemed enough for the different groups in the kingdom. Inside the country, disagreements grew more pronounced. The Serb establishment in Belgrade tried to hold on to centralized authority. Croats, however, felt increasingly alienated, especially after years of Alexander's suppression of their parties and organization. Slovenes wanted guarantees of autonomy, while Bosniaks, Macedonians, and other minorities felt no one represented their interests. By the late 1930s, it was clear the state remained fractured and directionless, divided into communities that could not agree on how the monarchy should be structured. In 1939, an arrangement was attempted to calm tensions. Known as the Sjevic-Kavik-Makek Agreement, it created the Biane Overlay of Croatia, granting Croatian lands broader autonomy under their own administration. At first glance, this looked like a solution, but in practice, it encouraged other communities to seek similar treatment. Slovenes in Bosnia pointed to the Croatian precedent, asking why they could not get equal recognition. Macedonians voiced complaints about lacking cultural rights. The agreement satisfied some but made overall demands for change much louder. Instead of stabilizing the country, it revealed how fragile the political balance had become. While internal divisions deepened, external dangers grew faster. Across Europe, fascism and Nazism were rising. Italy under Mussolini had ambitions in the Adriatic. Germany under Hitler expanded rapidly after annexing Austria in 1938 and dismantling Czechoslovakia in 1939. Yugoslavia suddenly found itself surrounded by powerful neighbors whose ideology and interest threatened its independence. Facing this print, Paul chose a cautious foreign policy. He leaned toward appeasement, hoping that by showing goodwill to Berlin and Rome, he could buy time for Yugoslavia and keep it out of the brewing global war. That balancing act could only last so long. By March 1940, Hitler demanded a clear commitment. Under enormous pressure, Yugoslavia signed the tripartite pact formally aligning with the Axis powers. Paul hoped the move would shield the country from immediate invasion, but ordinary citizens saw it as betrayal. Protests broke out, especially in Belgrade, where crowds filled the streets shouting against the agreement. Demonstrations grew too large, and Paul's policy of quiet compromise fell apart in days. On March 27, 1940, when a coup d'etat, supported by Britain, removed the Regency Council from power, the young King Peter I was declared of age, though only 17, and the government reversed its alliance with the Axis. The move shocked Hitler. He had assumed Yugoslavia would submit to the new political order in Europe, but instead the country pledged to resist. Preparing an invasion became his immediate priority. The coup had consequences far beyond Yugoslavia's borders. Hitler delayed Operation Barbarossa, his invasion of the Soviet Union, by several weeks to redirect German forces toward the Balkans. Many historians later argued this delay contributed to Germany's failure when winter arrived outside Moscow. Ironically, the tripartite pact signed hoping to avoid war ended up provoking the opposite. Attempts at neutrality had collapsed, setting the stage for the devastating invasion that followed. On April 6, 1940, one German bombers appeared over Belgrade in the early morning. The campaign, named Operation Punishment, began with waves of heavy bombing lasting 3 days. The air raids aimed not only to disable the Yugoslav army, but also to terrorize civilians. Thousands were killed and fires spread across large parts of the capital. Among buildings lost was the historic National Library, housing hundreds of thousands of manuscripts and rare works. Destroying so many cultural artifacts symbolized the scale of instant devastation. The bombing was only the beginning. German, Italian, Hungarian and Bulgarian troops invaded from every direction. Yugoslavia's army, large on paper, with over 700,000 men, was poorly coordinated, understaffed, incurious and divided by internal rivalries. Loyalty varied by region, and many soldiers had little will to defend a state they saw as dominated by rival ethnic groups. Within days, Axis units broke through defenses. German troops advanced rapidly into Serbia. Italians pressed into Montenegro and Dalmatian coastal towns. Hungarians occupied the north, and Bulgarian divisions swept into Macedonia. The country surrendered on April 17, only 11 days after the first bombs fell on Belgrade. The dismemberment of Yugoslavia followed almost immediately. Germany took northern Slovenian parts of Serbia, including Belgrade, where it installed an occupation administration. Italy annexed sections of Dalmatia along the coast, added Montenegro to its control, and claimed influence over parts of Kosovo. Hungary absorbed Vojvodina. Bulgaria annexed most of Macedonia and southern Serbia. Perhaps the most dramatic change came with the creation of the independent state of Croatia, often called the ND8. This state, stretching across Croatia and Bosnia and Herzegovina, was given to the Ustase, a fascist movement operating in exile before the invasion. The NDH immediately launched one of the most brutal campaigns in wartime Europe. Its leaders aimed to create an ethnically pure Croat state. Policies targeted Serbs, Jews and Roma with forced conversions, expulsions and mass killings. Camps like Jasenoka became sites of systematic murder. In months, violence reached levels so extreme, even some German and Italian officials expressed discomfort at its brutality. These policies left scars, shaping relations between communities for generations. Serbia itself was placed under direct German military occupation. A puppet administration led by General Ned IC operated under German supervision, but real authority stayed with the Wehrmacht and Gestapo. Belgrade became a center of repressive rule where executions and mass arrests were routine. Yet despite this control, resistance began stirring almost immediately. In the mountains of Serbia and Montenegro, groups loyal to the royal government in exile known as the Chetniks organized local uprisings. At the same time, communist activists using networks built before the war laid groundwork for what became the partisan movement. Yugoslavia's sudden collapse stands out in military history. Despite its large army, the kingdom disintegrated in less than 2 weeks, one of the most rapid defeats of a sovereign state in modern time. Reasons went beyond military strength. Deep political divisions, lack of preparation, and mistrust between national groups left the state unable to resist. Unity, already fragile in peacetime, vanished once Axis forces crossed its borders. Out of the ruins emerged the stark realities of occupation terror and the beginnings of civil war. After the Yugoslav kingdom collapsed in 1940, the country fractured into occupied zones and puppet states. But almost immediately resistance took shape. Two groups rose above the rest, both claiming to fight for liberation yet divided by ideology and strategy. The first were the Chetniks, led by Dear as a Mihailovic, a royalist general envisioning a Yugoslavia restored under the old monarchy shaped around Srebrenica. The second were the partisans, commanded by Josip Broz Tito, a committed communist promoting not only liberation from the Axis, but also social revolution. At first glance, they shared a common goal, driving out foreign occupiers. In practice, their paths diverged almost immediately. The Chetniks concentrated on protecting Serbian civilians, establishing strongholds in rural areas, and waiting for the right moment to strike larger blows. Mihailovic believed premature confrontation with the Axis would only invite brutal reprisals against the population. As a result, Chetnik commanders often avoided combat unless victory seemed likely. Over time, this meant they engaged in fewer battles with Axis troops and, in some regions, struck local understandings with Italian or German forces for supplies or security guarantees against the partisans. These arrangements helped them survive short minor term, but undermined their claim to lead the national resistance. Tito's partisans chose a very different path. They launched a widespread guerrilla campaign, striking German garrisons, sabotaging transport routes, and mobilizing volunteers across occupied territory. While rooted in communist ideology, the movement appealed beyond class politics. Tito emphasized the unity of all South Slavs regardless of religion or nationality. His slogans invited Croats, Serbs, Slovenes, Bosniaks, and others to join side by side in a new struggle promising not only liberation but equality. This message attracted growing support, especially in mixed regions like Bosnia, where communities faced violence from both occupiers and local collaborators. By 1940, the open rivalry between Chetniks and partisans turned violent. Skirmishes escalated into large battles, with each side trying to control liberated zones. In some regions, Yugoslavia effectively descended into civil war within a broader world war. Complexity intensified in Bosnia and Herzegovina, where partisans, Chetniks, as militias, and Axis soldiers often fought in the same areas at different times. Civilians found themselves caught between shifting front lines, enduring massacres, reprisal killings, and forced displacements. For villagers, the arrival of armed groups rarely meant protection. Instead, it could trigger violent retaliation from an opposing side days later. As the war dragged on, the Allies monitored developments inside Yugoslavia closely. At first, Mihailovic and the royal government in exile held recognition, but intelligence reports and the minus ground observations began highlighting parties and effectiveness compared to the oft unpassive Chetniks. By 1943, British and American officials switched support to Tito. Supplies, weapons, and advisors flowed increasingly into parties and controlled territory, boosting their capacity to fight. The recognition was a major blow to the Chetniks, soon marginalized as collaborators rather than heroes. Across 1943 and 1940, Tito's forces expanded into a disciplined, large scale military organization. They liberated swaths of territory, created provisional governments, and enforced their vision of unity. By the time the Soviet Red Army entered Yugoslavia in 1940, the partisans already operated as a conventional army with hundreds of thousands of fighters. They coordinated with the Soviets liberating Belgrade, but emphasized much of their success had come from within. What made the partisan movement stand out was its achievement compared to resistance groups elsewhere in Europe. Unlike the Free French, whose liberation depended on allied armies, Tito's forces were uniquely able to drive out occupiers largely by their own strength. This gave them legitimate authority when the war ended and positioned Tito as the uncontested leader of the new Yugoslavia. But such victory carried unimaginable cost. Over 1 million people perished in Yugoslavia during the war, many civilians. Killings by occupiers, massacres between rival groups and retaliatory violence left layers of trauma researchers still debate today. The overlapping roles of victims and perpetrators made these years one of the most morally complex chapters in the entire conflict. When the war ended in 1945, the partisans stood as the dominant force inside Yugoslavia. They had not only resisted the Axis with considerable success, but had built parallel structures of authority in liberated territories. Their leader Josip Broz Tito commanded both military power and mass loyalty. Unlike many other partisan leaders in Europe, he entered the post-war period with complete control of the state. By November 29, the monarchy, restored in name during the war, was abolished and the Federal People's Republic of Yugoslavia was declared. The new order defined itself as socialist, born from the anti-fascist struggle and promising an identity reaching beyond narrow nationalism. From the outset, the state was set up as a federation. 6 republics made its formal structure: Slovenia, Croatia, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Serbia, Montenegro and Macedonia. Within Serbia itself, 2 autonomous provinces were also created: Vojvodina in the north and Kosovo in the south. This arrangement was more than symbolism. It acknowledged the region's ethnic and cultural complexity, attempting to show balance. Tito's government presented this federal design as a guarantee no single group would dominate the rest, a lesson drawn from the interwar kingdom's instability. Despite calling itself a communist state, the new Yugoslavia did not align completely with Moscow. At this stage, Tito respected his wartime alliance with the Soviets, but his government displayed fierce independence. Unlike satellite regimes installed elsewhere in Eastern Europe, Yugoslavia charted its own course. The guiding slogan became brotherhood and unity. The phrase was not empty propaganda, but a deliberate attempt to reverse legacies of ethnic violence and civil war. In official events, school programs and posters, the unity of South Slavs and equality of different religious groups were promoted as the state's foundation. However, building that unity required strict political control. The League of Communists of Yugoslavia, as Tito's party came to be called, became the only legal party. Monarchists, rival communists, and those accused of collaboration during the war were arrested or exiled. Purges removed opposition voices, sometimes through trials, other times by simple imprisonment. Political decisions concentrated in leadership circles around Tito and dissent was quickly silenced. The message was clear: unity could only be protected through one party control and the firm hand of the partisans now in power. Alongside political consolidation, reconstruction became the regime's top priority. Infrastructure lay in ruins after years of occupation and battles. Roads, bridges and rail lines were rebuilt with state direction. Factories were nationalized and industrialization became central to economic policy. Education campaigns aiming to wipe out illiteracy reached rural areas where formal schooling had been scarce. By the late 1940s, visible change marked many cities and towns. Within only a few years, Yugoslavia began to look less like a war-torn land and more like a modern state rebuilding at impressive speed. Yugoslavia also asserted itself on the global stage. Tito refused to allow outside forces to dictate his country's future. He famously threatened to shoot down Allied planes flying into Yugoslav airspace without permission, a daring stance few leaders in Eastern Europe could have adopted post-war. In another bold step, Yugoslav units occupied parts of Trieste in Italy just months after fighting ended. The move nearly sparked direct conflict with Western powers, but also signaled Yugoslavia was too strong a force to ignore. Tito's government had entered not only the post-war Balkans, but international politics with unprecedented confidence. In years immediately following World War II, Yugoslavia seemed locked firmly into the Soviet orbit. Josip Broz Tito and his partisan movement had come to power as committed communists, and early cooperation with Moscow was both expected and natural. Like other Eastern European states, Yugoslavia initially aligned policies with Stalin's leadership and joined the emerging Socialist bloc. But beneath the surface, contradictions between the two leaders grew quickly, and by 1948 those contradictions reached a breaking point, stunning the communist world. At the conflict's center was the question of loyalty. Stalin demanded strict obedience from every Eastern Bloc leader, treating them as regional administrators rather than independent rulers. He expected Yugoslavia to follow Soviet lines in foreign and domestic matters without argument. Tito, however, did not share that vision. He believed the sacrifices and victories of Yugoslavia's partisan struggle earned his country the right to chart its own course. He was unwilling to surrender that hard-1 independence, only to be reduced to a subordinate role under Moscow's command. One tension area was Yugoslav involvement in the Greek Civil War. As communists clashed with royalist forces supported by Britain and the United States, Tito provided them direct support and sanctuary. Stalin, pursuing a cautious approach to avoid open conflict with Western powers in Greece, was infuriating. Another dispute arose over the common form, a new Communist Information Bureau created in 1947 to coordinate the bloc. Stalin demanded Yugoslavia submit its military and internal policies to its structure. Tito flatly refused, unwilling to give away authority over his army, the very institution that had secured Yugoslavia's freedom. Matters came to a head in June 1948. The Comintern expelled Yugoslavia in a declaration, accusing its leaders of betraying socialism. Overnight, a country just emerging from war's destruction found itself cut off from international communist structures. Throughout Eastern Europe, allied governments quickly denounced its leadership, echoing Moscow's condemnation. Yugoslavia now faced possible isolation, sanctions, and even military intervention. Stalin attempted to crush Yugoslavia through covert means. Spies infiltrated the Yugoslav state. Propaganda attacked Tito in foreign and domestic media, and economic pressure was applied to break trade ties. Yet the result was the opposite of what Stalin hoped. Tito consolidated power, purging pro-Soviet figures within the League of Communists, and turning security services against dissidents who might side with Moscow. Repression intensified, but so did Yugoslavia's sense of political independence. Out of crisis came the first version of what could be called Tito's system, stressing a separate path to socialism outside Soviet control. This independence was dangerous, but it also opened unexpected opportunities. With the split from the Soviet bloc, Yugoslavia searched for economic partners and found them in the West. The United States, anxious to prevent further Soviet expansion in Europe, began delivering financial aid and development program. For the first time in the Cold War, a communist nation accepted support from Washington without abandoning socialism. The unusual situation meant Yugoslavia remained the only communist government in Europe capable of receiving aid from both sides of the divided world order. Stalin never forgave Tito for this act of defiance. He tried again and again to eliminate him, sending assassins and encouraging conspiracies. Reports suggest over 20 different attempts were made, yet none succeeded. Tito himself mocked these failures in a blunt message to Stalin, saying, "Stop sending people to kill me. If you don't stop, I will send one to Moscow and I won't have to send a second." When Stalin died in 1953, Tito remained in power, stronger than ever and uniquely respected among global leaders. He would ultimately outlive his rival by nearly 30 years, presiding over Yugoslavia that continued following its own independent course. In 1961, at the height of Cold War polarization, Yugoslavia positioned itself in an entirely new role on the international stage. While most communist governments had been absorbed into the Soviet orbit and much of Western Europe tied itself after when Tito refused to let his country be constrained by either camp. Instead, he set out to organize a third path, while allowing states to maintain independence while resisting domination from the two superpowers. This idea soon developed into the non-aligned movement coalition, growing into one of the most significant forces in 20th century global diplomacy. The first official non-aligned summit took place in Belgrade in September 1961. Tito hosted the gathering, welcoming other leaders, sharing his search for autonomy in a divided world. Among them were Jawaharlal and Nehru of India, Gamal Abdel Nasser of Egypt, Kwame Nkrumah of Ghana, and Sukarno of Indonesia. These figures represented countries recently emerging from colonial rule, determined to secure their own voice in world politics. By bringing them together under one banner, Yugoslavia signaled it was not an isolated Balkan state, but a country with a central role reshaping global alignments. For the nations of Africa, Asia, and Latin America, the Cold War often looked less like a battle of ideologies and more like continued imperial interference. They sought political space where they could pursue their own agendas without being forced into the struggle between Washington and Moscow. The non-aligned movement gave them that platform. It emphasized sovereignty, peaceful coexistence, and resistance to outside domination. Yugoslavia unexpectedly became the bridge between these post-colonial regions and the rest of the world, even though it was a European socialist state itself. Non-alignment had clear advantages for Yugoslavia. Economically, it meant access to both East and West. The country could trade with Western societies, drawing in technology and investment, while keeping the socialist system at home and cooperating with fellow communist states when useful. Politically, it gave Tito leverage. He could present himself as a mediator, speaking with leaders on both sides of the Iron Curtain. Hosting the summit in Belgrade began a pattern where Yugoslavia positioned itself as neutral ground, not bound to anyone's agenda, but open to all. This stance affected daily life for Yugoslav citizens. With their country not locked entirely behind the Iron Curtain, they enjoyed freedoms unavailable elsewhere in Eastern Europe. A Yugoslav passport granted unusual mobility, allowing travel across both Western and socialist states. This freedom of movement enhanced economic opportunities and created a distinctive Yugoslav identity, lending influences from several worlds. For many citizens, that sense of openness made them feel set apart from both Eastern Bloc neighbors and Western counterparts. Yugoslavia's prestige is clear looking at the range of foreign guests Tito entertained. Within a few years, he received Queen Elizabeth II, US President Richard Nixon, and Cuban revolutionary leader Fidel Castro. The ability to host such varied figures underlined how unusual his political balancing act was. It was rare for any leader, socialist or otherwise, to maintain active relationships across such different political landscape. By the 1970s, the non-aligned movement had grown into a formidable global force, with Yugoslavia maintaining diplomatic connections to over 100 nations. Beyond diplomacy, Yugoslav experts contributed to infrastructure projects in Africa, offered military instruction abroad, and even exported films circulating throughout the developing world. These activities expanded Yugoslavia's soft power. For a country of its size, it had influence far greater than its population or geography suggested. The separation from both superpowers, beginning as a survival strategy after the split with Stalin, had by now transformed Yugoslavia into a hub of international engagement, shaping politics of countries far beyond Europe's borders. The 1962 and 1972 marked a period of unusual prosperity for Yugoslavia. Unlike most Eastern Bloc neighbors, the country managed to combine socialism with access to Western markets. This strategy created a mixed economy, demonstrating steady growth, while also offering citizens more consumer goods than available in most other communist states. Factories expanded, industries modernized, and infrastructure grew to accommodate both domestic needs and international trade. At the same time, increasing tourist inflow from Europe and beyond brought valuable foreign currency, while partnerships with Western businesses helped build modern urban skylines, giving cities like Belgrade's Zagreb, Sarajevo, and Ljubljana a new confidence. Industrial development formed these years' backbone. Heavy industries like steel manufacturing sat alongside growing automotive and textile sectors, providing jobs while driving large minor-scale urbanization. Major infrastructure projects connected republics more closely, reducing isolation that had previously marked many regional communities. For many Yugoslavs, this created a sense the country was catching up with Western societies, even operating under a socialist framework. The rise of a consumer class changed everyday life as households gained access to televisions, appliances, and cars at rates standing out compared to other Eastern European countries. An equally important factor was workers moving abroad. The Gastarbeiter program allowed hundreds of thousands of Yugoslav citizens to take employment in Western Europe, particularly West Germany, Austria, and Switzerland. Their wages, far higher than available at home, were sent back as remittances, supporting families and fueling domestic consumption. This labor migration not only strengthened the Yugoslav economy, but also created cultural bridges as returning workers brought new experiences, fashions, and attitudes from abroad. The program became one of the clearest examples of the country's openness compared to more tightly controlled socialist neighbors. Cultural achievements accompanied this economic expansion. Yugoslavia fostered artistic and creative pluralism rare within socialist Europe. Its cinemas produced films gaining international recognition, often mixing social commentary with experimental techniques. Music ranged from traditional folk forms to growing rock and pop scenes, with bands and performers gaining audiences across the continent. The arts developed in a climate where state sponsorship existed, but with looser controls than those imposed in Warsaw or Moscow. As a result, intellectual life thrived, producing a combination of avant-garde art movements, accessible popular culture, and a unique regional identity, drawing interest from abroad. International exposure added to this distinctiveness. In 1961, Yugoslavia became the only communist state to appear in the Eurovision Song Contest, a symbol of its openness toward Western Europe. Participation in such events showcased the country's position as part of the European cultural fabric, while reinforcing it pursued its own path. For citizens, knowing they belonged to a state represented in both socialist and Western platforms provided pride and reinforced what became known even then as Yugo- nostalgia. This nostalgia built on memories of travel, freedom, stylish consumer products under multi-ethnic society, still managing to showcase unity during its best time. One striking detail captured the unique freedom Yugoslavs enjoyed. By the 1970s, their passports permitted travel to over 100 countries without a visa. These destinations included both the United States and the Soviet Union, a combination not even many Western Europeans could match. For ordinary Yugoslav citizens, it meant opportunities to study abroad, work overseas, or simply travel for leisure, contributing to a sense of belonging to a wider global community. This unusual advantage underscored how far the country had moved from Stalin's isolated Eastern Bloc to an era of connection, consumer growth, and cultural vitality, later remembered as its golden age. In 1970, Yugoslavia introduced a constitution fundamentally changing how the state operated. Rather than keeping firm central authority, this new system spread power across its 6 republics: Slovenia, Croatia, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Serbia, Montenegro, and Macedonia, while also elevating to autonomous provinces Kosovo and Vojvodina to near-equal status. Each region received broad powers, including its own president, legislature, judiciary, and significant control over economic planning. The design aimed to ensure equality among Yugoslavia's many national groups, but it significantly weakened the federal government's ability to enforce unity, including Kosovo and Vojvodina, as near-republics was particularly contentious. Both remained legally part of Serbia, but the constitution allowed them independence to operate almost as fully separate states. Serbian leaders viewed This is dismantling that country's historic influence within the Federation. Over time, resentment built among Serbian politicians and intellectuals arguing the republic was being fragmented internally unlike any others. This sense of unfair treatment became a major grievance, feeding later nationalist arguments. Serbia bore the settlement's losses while other republics gained more freedom. The idea behind constitutional reform was to lessen an ethnic rivalry, creating balance where no group could dominate. With so many powers at the regional level, decisions were expected through negotiation and compromise. But in practice, it created paralysis. Every Republican province had a de facto veto over major federal decisions. Policies on economic planning, education, and internal security often stalled as Republican leaders prioritized regional interests over the whole federation's needs. What Tito saw as a tool for stability often became a mechanism for disagreement, making it difficult to respond rapidly to crises or implement uniform strategies across the entire territory. The constitution also included an extraordinary guarantee. Tito was confirmed president for life. This was not merely ceremonial. It ensured that as long as he lived, there would be no question about top-level leadership. Tito stood as the one figure commanding loyalty across national lines, and the document enshrined that authority beyond all challenge. Still beneath that reassurance lay an inevitable question. What would happen to such a fragile arrangement once Tito was no longer around? By embedding his lifetime presidency inside a system built on rotating power, the Constitution practically admitted his eventual absence posed a profound problem. The leadership structure pointed to that exact issue. The federal presidency was rewritten to rotate annually among representatives of republics and provinces. Even while Tito lived, this principle began taking practical effect in secondary state institutions. Each year, a different leader from a different region held the symbolic top role, while Tito's overall presidency kept the system steady. The arrangement clearly meant, after his passing, the country would be ruled by leadership changing every year, with no permanent authority center. What was supposed to be balance risked turning into fragmentation. The 1970 Constitution scale reflected its ambitious, but perhaps unworkable nature. With 406 articles, it stood as one of the longest and most complicated constitutions written at the time. Even legal experts found it difficult to interpret, since it attempted to formalize so many autonomy and responsibility layers across different government levels. The practical outcome was clear enough, though. Leaders began using new rules to entrench themselves locally. Instead of strengthening unity, reforms encouraged a return to regionalism. As long as Tito lived, he could suppress open conflict. Once he was gone, it was uncertain who, if anyone, could hold such a divided system together. On May 4, 1980, Josip Broz Tito died aged 87 in Ljubljana, Slovenia. His passing ended nearly 4 decades of uninterrupted leadership and collapsed as central figure defining the Yugoslav project. For most across the Federation, Tito had been more than a politician. He was a unity symbol, a partisan struggle veteran, and the one leader able to stand toe-to-toe with global superpowers while maintaining independence. His death triggered national mourning and forced millions to confront an uncertain future where the center no longer held. The mourning process itself was extraordinary. Thousands filed past his coffin in solemn ceremonies, while millions across republics observed his death as a personal loss. It was not just an internal event. Tito's funeral became a rare moment of international convergence, drawing leaders from opposing ideological blocs coming together to pay respects. Margaret Thatcher represented Britain. Leonid Brezhnev came from Moscow. Indira Gandhi arrived from India, and Saddam Hussein from Iraq, alongside many others. Attendance numbering over 100 international delegations reflected Yugoslavia's global stature then. Few 20th century funerals matched its scale or diversity. Inside the country, however, grief quickly turned to uncertainty. Constitutional arrangements made 6 years earlier now determined governance course. The rotating presidency system came into effect, demanding leadership shift annually between representatives of 6 republics and provinces. On paper, this ensured fairness. In practice, it produced instability, with no single figure commanding authority. Decision-making slowed to a crawl. Policies required consensus often never materializing, and conflict of interest hardened into open disputes. Without it, OS ability to impose compromise suppressed disputes returned to the surface. Serbia grew increasingly resentful of special autonomy given to Vojvodina and Kosovo. Leaders in Slovenia and Croatia asserted their right to pursue policies more favorable to their own economies rather than federal programs. Questions of ethnic representation and political identity during its lifetime became mainstream dialogue again. Leaders across republics recognized the vacuum and, instead of rallying around the federal state, many focused on building their own regional support. Economic conditions added to this atmosphere. By the early 1980s, Yugoslavia carried heavy foreign debt, product of borrowing during previous decade development drives. Inflation worsened, unemployment rose, and living standards stagnated. The state, weakened by the new constitutional framework, lacked capacity to force broad reforms stabilizing the economy. Discontent spread unevenly across republics. Where some regions fared better, others struggled, visibly intensifying the sense the federation no longer acted as one coherent unit. Despite these challenges, Tito's legacy remained visible almost everywhere. Streets, factories, and institutions bore his name, and his image appeared in public offices long after his burial. Yet memory could not substitute authority. No successor emerged with charisma or legitimacy to unify such a diverse state. Leaders lacked stature to replace a man who had outlived Stalin, defied Western powers, and mediated global conflicts. Under their weaker leadership, nationalism became the natural alternative for mobilizing support. The funeral itself gave a final indication of how central Yugoslavia had been during Tito's lifetime. With representatives from 128 countries present, it was larger than ceremonies honoring Winston Churchill, John F. Kennedy, or even Joseph Stalin. Few events brought so many rivals together, and attendance scale underscored influence Tito had wielded. His burial in the House of Flowers in Belgrade carried symbolic and personal resonance. It was a site of full military honor, despite his lifelong communist identity, and soon became a pilgrimage site for citizens across republics. Even today, visitors from successor states continue coming, a reminder that while the Federation disintegrated, memory of its leaders still forms part of a shared past. The 1982 confronted Yugoslavia with problems, exposing Federation weakness after Tito's death. Economically, the country entered the decade carrying enormous foreign debt. Years borrowing to fund industrial expansion and infrastructure now returned as unaffordable obligations. Interest payments rose while declining productivity meant less revenue. Inflation eroded salaries rapidly, and unemployment climbed, especially among younger generations facing limited prospects. Previous decades' optimism began fading as living standards dropped and people found it harder to afford goods once representing mixed socialist economy pride. Differences between republics became sharper during this time. Slovenia and Croatia had more developed industries and foreign trade links, giving them advantages poorer republics could not match. Bosnia and Macedonia and Kosovo lagged behind, suffering chronic unemployment and weak infrastructure. This uneven development fueled increasing resentment. Poorer republic leaders accused wealthier ones of keeping resources for themselves, while Slovenia and Croatia argued they bore subsidizing others' burden through the federal system. Economic disparity became a political issue, and nationalist narratives framed these inequalities as evidence true fairness under federation could never be achieved. Ethnic tensions layered onto economic frustrations, particularly in Kosovo. The majority Albanian population sought greater autonomy and rights recognition. Many demanded Kosovo become a full republic equal to the 6 established ones. In 1981, just 1 year after Tito's death, Albanian student and worker protests exploded into major demonstrations. The government responded with military intervention, declaring actions a threat to federal unity. Soldiers deployed in the province, curfews imposed and hundreds arrested. The crackdown did little to settle matters. Instead, it began a cycle of protest, repression and renewed unrest characterizing Kosovo throughout the decade. The constitutional system Tito left aimed to stabilize federation, but achieved the opposite effect. The rotating presidency, with leadership shifting annually between republics and provinces, created a vacuum at the top. As republics disagreed over policies, federal decision-making stalled. Instead of rallying behind common strategies, regional leaders increasingly ignored federal decisions, pursuing their own course. Institutions once presenting a united front against outside threats now proved incapable of resolving domestic disputes. This atmosphere produced fertile ground for nationalism, imagining. Slovenian and Croatian intellectuals developed programs stressing autonomy, arguing their republics deserved more control over economies and political systems. In Serbia, a different argument rose to prominence. Writers, academics, and later political leaders complained autonomy given to Kosovo and Vojvodina, a fragmented Serbian power. Their solution was a call for re-centralization under Serbian leadership opposition, eventually escalating into demands for dominance within federation. What once was dismissed as fringe debate began entering everyday politics, openly discussed in newspapers, universities, and street gatherings. Culture reflected these divisions too. By the late 1980s, Yugoslav musicians and filmmakers pushed boundaries few other communist states tolerated. Rock bands performed songs mocking government inefficiency, while satirical films addressed ethnic rivalries and political dysfunction. These cultural productions gave ordinary people space to confront taboos, even as official politics claimed unity. In many ways, pop culture became an unofficial channel expressing frustrations and fears about federation's future. Externally, Yugoslavia's economic crisis tied it tighter to Western creditors. Debt reached over $20 billion at its height. To qualify for emergency loans from institutions like the International Monetary Fund, the government introduced austerity measures. Prices rose, subsidies disappeared, and everyday goods became scarce. Pressure devastated ordinary families facing unemployment at home or needing to migrate abroad for work. Strikes and protests multiplied while a growing underground economy replaced the official system, reflecting how far federations strayed from previous decades' prosperity. By the 1990s, Yugoslavia was unraveling. The federal government existed in name but lacked power to enforce decisions. Regional leaders, now elected through democratic contests, quickly replaced the old communist elite. Introducing multi-party elections in 1990 was a dramatic change after over 4 decades of one-party control. Instead of producing moderate leaders committed to compromise, it swept nationalist parties into power. In nearly every republic, campaigns centered on identity and historical grievances, and victors appealed to ethnic loyalty rather than brotherhood and unity, old idea. In Serbia, Slobodan Milosevic emerged as dominant political figure. He promoted a renewed federation vision, but one under centralized Serbian control. His stance placed him against Slovenia and Croatia, demanding greater independence. Slovenia, with relatively small ethnically uniform population, was already the most economically advanced republic. Its leaders saw little benefit, remaining tied to wider federation problems. Croatia followed a similar path, but its situation was more complex. A large Serb minority inside Croatia had little interest breaking away from Yugoslav statehood. This internal division would soon turn violent. On June 25, 1990, both Slovenia and Croatia declared independence. The Yugoslav People's Army, long describing itself as a multi-ethnic socialist army, was by then mostly controlled by Serbian officers. It moved quickly, suppressing declarations in Slovenia. This produced the 10-day, or a short conflict marked by minor clashes between Slovenian defense forces and federal army. The conflict ended in negotiated ceasefire, as Slovenia was not viewed strategically vital and its ethnic homogeneity made sustained conflict less practical. Croatia, however, descended into far bloodier struggle. In Croatia, Serb militias armed with federal army support staged uprisings declaring their own separatist entities. They proclaimed regions rejecting Croatian authority, insisting they remained part of what was left of Yugoslavia. Fighting soon spread across towns and cities, with sieges and battles causing massive destruction. The city of Vukovar became one of the most visible conflict symbols after weeks of bombardment left it in ruins. Ethnic cleansing campaigns drove Croats from Serb-controlled zones and Serbs from Croat-controlled territory, setting a violence and displacement pattern extending into Bosnia and beyond. Bosnia and Herzegovina, the most diverse republic, was caught in these developments with large Serb, Croat and Bosniak communities. Its politicians struggled maintaining balance as Yugoslavia crumbled. Each community feared domination by others and all sides prepared for possible war. Political compromises grew increasingly fragile, while paramilitary groups began organizing independently. Bosnia's strategic importance and ethnic complexity made it the likely next battleground once Slovenia and Croatia broke away. International actors attempted mediation. The European Community and later United Nations sought negotiating peace plans while debating recognizing breakaway republics. Germany pushed ahead recognizing Croatia and Slovenia by 1991, and a move sparking controversy inside Europe. Some argued it encouraged further disintegration, accelerating violence, while others insisted it acknowledged realities already on ground. Amid this chaos, Yugoslavia still technically upheld the 1970 for rotating presidency system. In 1991, the chair was due passing to Croatia. Serbia rejected the transfer, effectively blocking arrangement and revealing federal system as hollow shell. Refusal symbolized even United States pretense had collapsed. By early 1990, two independence declarations, armed insurgencies, and international involvement confirmed Yugoslavia no longer a single country, but a battlefield of competing national projects. On March 1, 1990, Bosnia and Herzegovina declared independence after a referendum boycotted by most Serb population. Supported by Slobodan Milosevic in Belgrade and backed by Yugoslav People's Army units, Bosnian Serb leaders rejected the vote, initiating a campaign carving a new state inside Bosnia. Their objective was joining these territories with Serbia, hoping to build what was often described as Greater Serbia. This move ignited the bloodiest conflict in Yugoslavia's collapse, setting stage for one of post-war Europe's most complex war. The conflict quickly organized into a three-sided struggle. Bosniaks, predominantly Muslim, supported Bosnia independence. Croats aligned with Croatia's national aspirations, sometimes cooperating with Bosniaks, but at other moments pursuing own territorial ambition. Bosnian Serbs controlled significant countryside areas with heavy weapons inherited from Yugoslav army support. Each community formed own armed forces, militias, and local defense units. Alliances shifted during war, with cooperation periods giving way to hostility as rival groups sought advantage in a landscape defined by rapidly changing front lines. The Bosnian Serb army emerged strongest single faction, led by Radovan Karadzic as political leader and General Ratko Mladic as military commander. Its strategy centered on ethnic cleansing. Villages, towns, and entire regions became targets. Non-Serb civilians were expelled, detained in makeshift camps, or massacred outright. The goal was establishing territory free of other populations, creating continuous Serb-controlled regions connected to Serbia proper. Communities living side by side for centuries suddenly became enemies, and many were destroyed through systematic terror campaigns. Urban centers suffered immense destruction. Sarajevo, the capital, was under siege nearly for years from 1990 to 1996. Sniper fire and shelling terrorized civilians daily. Over 11,000 people died during siege, including thousands of children, as the city endured modern warfare's longest capital blockade. Food, water, and medicine supplies were scarce. Yet residents organized survival ways, building underground tunnels, holding makeshift schools, and even staging concerts, maintaining life scent. The city's cultural heart, including historic libraries and monuments, was also targeted, representing assault not only on people, but Bosnia's multi-ethnic identity legacy. Other cities witnessed similar horror. Most are known for Ottoman-Air Bridge became prolonged combat site between Bosniak and Croat forces, and its heritage reduced to rubble. Across countryside, reports surfaced of detention camps where civilians were beaten, starved, and subjected to systematic abuse, including rape deliberately used as war weapon. Sexual violence scale was unprecedented in Europe since World War II. Years later, tribunals would reveal over 60% of all rape cases brought before international courts of that era traced back to Bosnia. The war's most infamous atrocity came July 1995 in Srebrenica. Declared a safe area by United Nations, the enclave fell to Bosnian Serb forces. Over 8,000 Bosniak men and boys were separated from families, murdered within days. The incident was later legally defined as genocide by international courts, the worst crime of its kind in Europe since 1945. International intervention lagged. United Nations peacekeepers deployed, but had little mandate, often powerless, preventing atrocities. Only in 1995, after Sarajevo's Markale market shelling killed scores of civilians, did NATO launch sustained airstrikes against Bosnian Serb positions. These actions shifted ground balance, forcing all sides toward negotiation. The war formally ended December 1995 with Dayton Accords signed in United States. Bosnia and Herzegovina remained a single sovereign state, but divided into two entities: the Federation of Bosnia and Herzegovina, dominated by Bosniaks and Croats, and Republika Srpska, largely Serb-controlled. The arrangement froze conflict, preserving Bosnia's territorial integrity, but embedded deep political divisions, shaping the country to this day. After the Bosnian War ended, Balkan attention shifted south to Kosovo, a Serbia province with ethnic Albanian majority. For decades, Albanian population demanded greater rights, either enhanced autonomy or outright independence. Their grievances stretched back generations, but sharpened sharply in 1989 when Slobodan Milosevic revoked Kosovo autonomy. Overnight, the province lost authority granted under old Yugoslav constitution. Albanian language schools closed. Political organizations banned, and direct police and military control from Belgrade became new normal. What followed was a repression decade, breeding deep resentment. Instead of silencing calls for self-determination, it created hostility and mistrust atmosphere, soon spiraling toward armed conflict. By mid-1992, many Kosovo Albanians' patience gave way to militants. This was when the Kosovo Liberation Army began taking shape. The KLA organized armed group, targeting Serbian police, government officials, and military units inside Kosovo. At first, attacks were limited, and Belgrade dismissed KLA as little more than terrorist network. But as organization expanded, gaining Albanian abroad support, its actions grew bolder. Its stated goal was simple: force Belgrade's withdrawal and secure independence. The Serbian state responded with overwhelming force, determined eliminating KLA and reasserting province control, showing strength. Beginning 1990, hate campaign escalated into counterinsurgency effort conducted by Yugoslav and Serbian police units. Villages suspected harboring KLA fighters were burned, while thousands of residents rounded up in mass arrests. Execution and systematic violence reports became widespread. Families forced from homes and entire communities emptied as campaigned across rural Kosovo. Instead of crushing armed resistance, assault intensified local KLA support, drawing mounting international condemnation. As winter turned toward spring, 1999 violence created humanitarian crisis. Hundreds of thousands of ethnic Albanians fled across borders into Macedonia and Albania, while others expelled directly as part of coordinated forced displacement campaign. Refugee columns and burned village images circulated worldwide, raising pressure on international community acting. Several negotiation rounds failed, neither side conceding core demands. Belgrade insisted Kosovo remain Serbia part, while Kosovo Albanians rejected anything short full independence. With diplomacy stalled, NATO intervened. On March 24, 1999, an NATO states coalition began bombing campaign against Yugoslav military targets, command facilities, and critical infrastructure. Campaign lasted 78 days, marking first time an NATO attacked sovereign country without United Nations mandate. The air war fought without NATO ground troops, making it historically significant as first war waged entirely by air power. Destruction across Serbia, extensive and civilian infrastructure, including bridges, factories and power grids, suffered heavy damage. By June, pressure proved overwhelming. Milosevic agreed withdrawing forces from Kosovo. NATO peacekeepers entered province under United Nations administered mission. Legally, Kosovo remained Serbia part. Practically, it was now governed by international authorities, setting foundation for later unilateral independence declaration. The war left scars stretching far beyond politics. Over 850,000 ethnic Albanians displaced, and forensic evidence discovered later revealed mass graves scattered across Serbia, some moved, attempting hiding atrocities. These findings demonstrated crime's systematic nature, defining Kosovo conflict as both then NATO global politics role turning point and tragic, final act violent Yugoslavia collapse. By new millennium early years, very little remained of multi-ethnic federation Yugoslavia once stood. What left was reduced state, made up only Serbia and Montenegro. Officially it carried name Federal Republic of Yugoslavia after 1992, but 2003 rebranded State Union of Serbia and Montenegro. Terminology change reflected what country became a looser political arrangement, not unified state traditional sense. Each republic operated own government budget and the economic system functioning almost like two separate states, died shared diplomacy and military structures. For most people living Belgrade or Podgorica, life marked differences between two entities rather than strong belonging same federation sense. Union's symbolic nature became clear 2006 when Montenegro decided holding own independence referendum. European Union observers insisted strict requirement majority, at least 55% needed validating vote. Results revealed how divided population was just over that threshold. 515% decided favoring breaking away. On June 3, 2006, Montenegro officially declared independence and union dissolved without major violence or conflict. Political partnership, once last remnant Yugoslav state, disappeared almost overnight, replaced to fully separate republics. 2 days later, June 5, Serbia followed own declaration. It announced itself sole legal successor, former state, inheriting diplomatic representation, army and international obligations continuity. The moment carried symbolic weight far greater than administrative procedure transferring officers or flags. For first time nearly a century, Yugoslavia's east existing political entity, any form. A state once stretching Adriatic coast, Greece and Hungary borders, now ended Serbia, standing alone at her. Kosovo question soon complicated picture further. Although officially remaining Serbia, a part province under United Nations administrations since 1999 war end. Full independence calls accelerated and 2008 declaration finally came. Kosovo unilaterally announced itself sovereign state. Over 100 countries eventually recognizing independence, but powerful actors like Russia-China refused, as did Serbia. This decision left Kosovo status and resolved its recognition fragmented across international systems. For region, it became last major step Yugoslavia, disintegration, confirming all federal territory splits, even distinct political units. By this time, Balkans map completely redrawn. Slovenia, Croatia, Bosnia and Herzegovina, North Macedonia, Montenegro, Serbia and Kosovo still disputed. Some states replaced single country, once projected unity. Each new republic began moving own pace toward European integration. Yet 1992's conflicts, population displacement, and nationalism persistence left scars shaping public opinion, political life, well into 21st century. Joining European institutions process became not just prosperity path, but also way managing divisions left behind. Collapse years also left unusual reminders. 1992's hyperinflations, the year one last Yugoslav in our denominations printed carrying 500 billion value. Banknotes this scale became collect items, grim monument. Economic collapse preceding final disintegration. Wider historical scale highlighted how fast transformation taken place. A country once praised balance between East and West, often seen proof socialist multiculturalism endure, had by 2008 gone through for wars, multiple ethnic cleansing cases, communism rise, fallen 7 new states emergence. Few Europe regions witnessed such concentrated upheaval single generation span. Yugoslavia, an ever-nation traditional sense. It was experiment stitched together, empires held fragile compromise. Without Tito, power struggles nationalism tore apart. Its history leaves us question. Can unity survive without shared identity? Or is division inevitable? And so this chapter of history slowly fades into the quiet flow of time. Some mysteries remain unanswered and some truths continue to shape our world. We have walked through the past together and learned what it can teach us. If you carry this knowledge forward with you through each day, then the echoes of history will never be lost. Thank you for listening. Until next time, let the past remain alive in your mind.